Eliza tried to focus on her work. She wrung the cleaning rag into the bucket, watching the dirt dissolve into the murky water, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. The crying from upstairs drilled into her mind like a relentless bit, grinding down memories she had tried so hard to bury. She told herself it wasn't her business. She was only there to mop floors. She had no right to go upstairs. She had no right to touch anything that belonged to the Mafia boss, Matteo Ricci. In this world, people like her were invisible ghosts, existing only to serve and disappear when they were no longer needed. One wrong step could cost her her job, or worse, her life. She had heard the stories about Matteo Ricci. They said he killed without blinking. They said he buried his enemies beneath concrete foundations. They said no one had ever betrayed him and lived to tell the tale. Eliza didn't know how much of it was true, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't take the risk. She needed this job. She needed every small coin to pay off the crushing hospital debt Ryan had left behind before he vanished. She needed to survive, even if her life no longer felt like it meant anything at all. But that crying, God, that crying, it sounded just like her son in the final hours of his short life. Weak, desperate, begging to be saved. Eliza closed her eyes, trying to force the image away. She remembered her child's blue lips. She remembered the warmth leaving his skin in her arms. She remembered Ryan screaming in her ear, blaming her for not saving the baby. He said she was useless. He said she had killed his son. Then he left, abandoning her to the wreckage. Eliza's tears fell onto the cold stone floor, blending with the dirty water. She hated herself for still being able to cry. She hated herself for still being able to feel pain. She had thought her heart had died with her son 6 weeks earlier, but it was still beating, still hurting, still shattering every time she heard a child cry. Then suddenly, silence crashed down. The crying stopped. Not the gentle kind of silence that comes when a baby has been soothed, but an abrupt cut, as if someone had crushed the sound mid-breath. Eliza froze. The mop slipped from her hands and struck the stone with a hollow echo in the empty space. Her heart clenched. She knew this silence. She had heard it once before. In the hospital, when the doctors stopped trying to revive her son, it was the silence of death. No, it couldn't be. Her feet moved before her mind could catch up. She ran for the stairs, her heart pounding as if it were about to burst from her chest. She didn't care about the rules anymore. She didn't care about the danger anymore. She didn't care what Matteo Ricci might do to her anymore. There was only one thought in her mind. She couldn't let another child die. Not in front of her. Not when she could do something. She had failed her own son. She hadn't saved him. But tonight, maybe fate was giving her a second chance. Eliza charged up the staircase, leaving her torn sandals behind at the foot of the stairs as they slowed her down. Her bare feet hit the icy marble steps, but she felt nothing except the terror swallowing her reason whole. The upper hallway lay in darkness, lit only by weak moonlight slipping through the windows. She ran toward the room where the crying had come from, where that deadly silence now waited. And as her hand closed around the door handle, Eliza didn't know that she was stepping into the moment that would change her life forever. The nursery door creaked open with a sound that sent a chill through her bones. A wave of stench hit Eliza full in the face, making her gag. It was the sour rot of spoiled milk, the heavy reek of diapers left unchanged, and something sickly sweet she recognized instantly. The smell of illness, the smell of death lurking nearby. Eliza stepped into the room, her eyes taking a few seconds to adjust to the darkness. Weak moonlight slipped through the thin curtains, washing over the white crib in a pale glow like the skin of a corpse. She moved closer, and what she saw made her heart stop for a brief, terrifying moment. Baby Leo lay motionless in the crib. His eyes were half closed, revealing a thin strip of frightening white. His skin was flushed from a raging fever, yet his lips were pale and cracked, with traces of dried blood clinging to them. His tiny mouth hung slightly open, struggling to draw breath, each one so shallow and faint that Eliza had to lean close just to hear it. He didn't have the strength to cry anymore. He was slipping away. Eliza reached out and touched his forehead, then recoiled as if burned. His skin was hot like live embers. The fever had been consuming his tiny body for hours without anyone noticing. She looked around the room and saw a baby bottle lying on the floor. The milk inside turned a cloudy yellow and reeking sour. Flies buzzed around its mouth. She couldn't believe it. Who could abandon a newborn like this? Who could leave such a fragile life to endure this kind of hell alone? Eliza spun around and ran into the hallway, screaming in despair. "Is anyone there? Please, someone help me. The baby needs help." Her voice echoed through the silent mansion, but no one answered. The cold walls swallowed her cries whole. She rushed to Mateo's study and pounded on the door again and again, but the room was completely soundproof. She ran downstairs to look for the guards, only to remember they were posted at the outer gate, hundreds of meters away. She didn't have time. Baby Leo didn't have time. Eliza ran back to the nursery, her breath ragged, tears streaming down her face. She stood beside the crib, looking down at the dying child, and suddenly she no longer saw Leo. She saw her own son. She saw his tiny eyes closing, his skin growing cold, his breathing fading second by second. She saw herself 6 weeks earlier, powerless as the fragile life she had brought into the world slipped from her hands forever. No, this couldn't happen. Not again. This time she wouldn't stand there and watch. This time she wouldn't let death take another child right in front of her. Eliza bent down, gently sliding her hands beneath Leo's burning little body and lifting him up. He was so light it terrified her. Light like a dried leaf, like a soul about to drift away. He didn't react when she picked him up, didn't cry, didn't move, just lay limp in her arms like a cloth doll. Eliza pressed him against her chest, feeling the fever scorching his body through her thin clothes. She rushed into the adjoining bathroom, one arm holding him tight, the other turning on the cold water. She soaked a washcloth and began wiping his body, trying to bring down the deadly heat. His forehead, his neck, his chest, his arms and legs. Baby Leo let out a weak whimper, the first sound he'd made since Eliza entered the room. A flicker of hope sparked inside her. He was still alive. He was still fighting. She kept cooling him, her lips whispering broken prayers without stopping. Please live. Please don't give up. I won't let you die. I swear I won't let you die. But after 10 minutes, the fever hadn't broken. And baby Leo began to fuss weakly, his cracked lips searching on instinct, his mouth opening and closing as if trying to latch onto something that wasn't there. He was hungry to the point of death, and Eliza had no milk to give him. Or rather, she did, but she didn't dare. Eliza looked down at the baby in her arms, her heart splitting in two. Her chest ached with tight, painful fullness, milk still coming in steadily for 6 weeks now, even though there was no child left to feed. It was the cruelest torture fate had devised for her. Every day she had to express that milk through tears, watching what should have sustained her child flow down the drain like waste. She had begged for the milk to dry up. She had wished her body would stop producing that meaningless liquid. But it kept coming, a relentless reminder that she had once been a mother, and now she was nothing at all. Baby Leo whimpered weakly in her arms, his mouth searching on instinct, his cracked lips brushing against the fabric of her blouse and beginning to suckle. Eliza's heart clenched. She knew she was standing at a point of no return. If she did this, she would cross every boundary. She would touch the son of the most ruthless mafia boss in Chicago in a way no one was ever allowed to. She could lose her job. She could lose her life. But if she didn't, this baby would die right in her arms, and she would have to live with that nightmare for the rest of her life. Tears streamed down Eliza's face as she looked at the tiny fever-flushed face. Baby Leo was innocent. He was only a 2-month-old child abandoned in the darkness, starving and sick, unseen by anyone, just like her son. Her child had also fought alone in his final hours while she stood powerless, watching doctors try and fail. Her baby had died without ever tasting a drop of his mother's milk, because he was born too early, because everything happened too fast, because she hadn't had time to do anything at all. Eliza closed her eyes, and in the darkness behind her lids, she saw her son. She saw the tiny eyes that had never opened to look at the world. She saw the lips that had never touched his mother's breast. She saw the small hands that had never curled around her finger. Her son had died without ever knowing what it felt like to be held, to be fed, to be loved by his mother. And tonight, another baby was about to suffer the same fate. No. Eliza opened her eyes, the decision made. She wouldn't let it happen. No matter the cost, she would save this child. With trembling hands, Eliza unfastened her blouse. She sat down in the rocking chair by the window, where moonlight poured in and formed a gentle halo around her. She drew baby Leo close, lifted his head, and guided him toward her breast. He found his source of life instantly. His cracked lips latched on and began to nurse. Weak at first, then stronger and stronger. Eliza choked back a sob. That feeling, she had dreamed of that feeling for 6 weeks. The feeling of giving life, the feeling of nourishing a fragile soul, the feeling of being a mother. Her tears fell onto baby Leo's face, but he didn't care. He only nursed, as if it were the only thing left in the world. His eyes remained closed, but his tiny hands began to move, clutching at her blouse as if afraid she might disappear. Eliza held him closer, lowering her head to kiss the fine, silken wisps of hair on his scalp. "My child, I'm sorry," she whispered, not knowing whether she was speaking to baby Leo or to the ghost of her own son. "I couldn't save you. I failed you, but I won't fail again. I'll save you. I swear I'll save you." Time passed in silence. Baby Leo fed his fill and began to breathe more steadily. The fierce red of fever slowly softened, returning to the pale pink of a healthy newborn. His little fists stayed clenched in Eliza's blouse, unwilling to let go. She looked down at his peaceful face, and for the first time in 6 weeks, she smiled. A smile soaked in tears, a smile filled with pain, and with comfort all the same. She had saved him. The milk she had once cursed, the substance she had begged her body to stop producing, had turned out to be the miracle that saved a fragile life. Maybe this was why her body had kept making milk. Maybe this was the purpose fate had chosen for her. Maybe her son in heaven had sent this baby to her so she could be a mother once more, even if only for this brief moment. Eliza sat motionless in the rocking chair, holding baby Leo as he slept deeply in her arms. The room sank into stillness. The storm outside the window had eased, leaving only the soft patter of rain like a lullaby. She closed her eyes, savoring this rare moment of peace. She didn't know that in the hallway beyond, heavy footsteps were drawing closer. She didn't know that the nursery door was about to open. And she didn't know that the cold, steel-gray eyes of the Mafia boss were about to witness a scene that would change everything. The nursery door burst open with a sharp, jarring sound. Matteo Ricci stood in the doorway, his tall frame etched against the moonlight like a reaper stepping out of the shadows. His cold, gray eyes swept across the room and froze when they landed on the scene before him. A woman he couldn't even remember was sitting in the rocking chair by the window, her blouse open, his son cradled against her body with his lips still pressed to her breast. Moonlight bathed the two of them like a sacred painting, but to Matteo, it was an unforgivable violation. Eliza jolted awake. She lifted her head and felt the blood in her veins turn to ice when she saw the man standing at the door. She had seen Matteo Ricci from a distance a few times since working here, but never this close, never with that look. His eyes weren't human. They were the eyes of a predator, cold, ruthless, and simmering with restrained fury. The scar slashing through his left eyebrow stood as a warning of the violence this man was capable of. Eliza hurriedly pulled her blouse closed, but the movement made baby Leo stir and let out a soft whimper. She didn't dare put him down for fear of waking him, yet she didn't dare keep holding him in front of his father either. She was trapped, trembling like a rabbit beneath a wolf's fangs. "What the hell do you think you're doing here?" Matteo's voice cut through the room, low and hard as steel. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. Every word landed like a sledgehammer, crushing any thought of resistance. Eliza tried to speak, but her throat felt clenched tight. She swallowed, her voice shaking as she forced the words out. "Sir, I can explain." "Explain." Matteo stepped into the room, each footstep echoing like a war drum in the silence. "Do you think there's any explanation for what you're doing? You touched my son. You fed my son. Who do you think you are to dare do that?" Eliza shrank back in the chair, instinct screaming at her to run, to beg, to do anything to escape this man's wrath. But another part of her, the part that had died with her son 6 weeks earlier, wasn't afraid anymore. She had already lost everything. What was there left to lose? "Sir, the baby was dying," Eliza said, her voice still trembling but her gaze refusing to drop. "When I found him, his fever was so high his skin was burning red. The bottle in the room was spoiled. Flies were all over it. The nanny was gone. No one knew where. I screamed for help and no one answered. I pounded on your door, but no one heard me." Matteo stopped cold. His eyes scanned the room, seeing for the first time what Eliza had described. The bottle lying on the floor, the sour stench hitting his nose, dirty diapers piled in the corner. The nursery he had spent tens of thousands of dollars decorating now reeked like a pigsty. He felt his anger shift, away from the woman in front of him and toward whoever had allowed this to happen. But he couldn't let that anger show. Not in front of a servant. "If he had died, I would never forgive myself," Eliza continued, her voice breaking. "I lost my son 6 weeks ago. I watched him die in my arms and couldn't do anything. I couldn't let that happen again. I can't stand by and watch a child die in front of me. You can kill me. You can do whatever you want to me. But please, look at your son. He's alive. He's breathing. He's safe. Matteo looked down at the son he had avoided for 2 months. Baby Leo lay quietly in Eliza's arms, his face peaceful, his breathing steady, his lips pink and full. The last time Matteo had seen him, the baby had been crying weakly from hunger, inconsolable. Now he slept as if nothing had ever been wrong. Something unfamiliar rose in Matteo's chest. He didn't know what it was. Gratitude, relief, or shame that he had neglected his own child so completely that a servant had been forced to sacrifice herself to save him. He turned away, his voice cold but no longer sharp. "Put my son back in his crib and leave the room. I'll deal with this in the morning." Eliza carefully placed baby Leo back into the crib, her hands shaking as she let him go. He stirred but didn't wake, his tiny fists still clenched, as if searching for the warmth he'd lost. She stood, lowered her head, and walked past Matteo toward the door. As she reached him, she paused for a brief second. "The baby needs to be seen by a doctor. The fever has gone down, but he still needs to be monitored." Then she disappeared into the darkness of the hallway, leaving Matteo standing alone in the nursery with the son he had been too afraid to face for far too long. The clock in the grand hall struck 3 as the side door of the mansion creaked open. Veronica Hayes slipped inside like a stray cat, her high heels clutched in her hand to avoid making a sound. The scent of champagne and expensive perfume still clung to her, mingling with cigarette smoke from the nightclub. Her golden blonde hair hung loose and tangled, her makeup smeared after hours of dancing and laughing with her upper-class friends. She had had a wonderful night, spending her employer's money without anyone knowing. At least that was what she thought. She had barely stepped onto the first stair when the lights snapped on, blindingly bright. Veronica froze, her heart seeming to stop as she saw Matteo Ricci seated in an armchair at the center of the hall, his cold gray eyes fixed on her. Beside him stood Tony Marchetti, arms crossed, his expression anything but friendly. "Sir Ricci." Veronica tried to summon her most charming smile, but the tremor in her voice betrayed the fear inside her. "You're still awake? Where were you?" Matteo cut in, his voice icy. Veronica swallowed, her mind spinning as it searched for the perfect excuse. "Sir, the baby was sleeping peacefully, so I took the chance to go out and buy more formula. The kind the young master uses had run out, and the nearest shop didn't have it, so I had to go farther. I'm sorry I was gone so long." Matteo said nothing. He simply signaled to Tony, and the loyal bodyguard stepped forward and tossed a stack of photographs at Veronica's feet. She looked down and felt the blood in her veins turn to ice. The pictures showed her dancing in a nightclub, drinking with friends, laughing beside a strange man. Each photograph bore a timestamp, proving she had been there all night instead of buying milk as she had claimed. Tony had followed her from the moment she left. Matteo rose from his chair and walked toward Veronica with terrifying slowness. "Do you think I'm stupid enough to believe you?" Veronica backed away until her spine hit the wall. She knew she had been cornered. In Matteo Ricci's world, lying was a capital offense. She had seen what happened to those who dared deceive him. She didn't want to end like them. Her mind raced wildly, searching for a way out. Then she remembered what she had glimpsed while sneaking back in, the light in the nursery, someone moving inside. A vicious idea took shape. "Sir, I'm sorry. I was wrong to leave tonight." Veronica suddenly dropped to her knees, her voice shifting into pathetic pleading. "But do you know what happened while I was gone? Do you know who went into your son's room?" Matteo frowned. He already knew about Eliza, but he wanted to see what this snake would say. "Go on. That cleaning girl. Eliza, or whatever her name is." Veronica lifted her head, her eyes shimmering with fake tears. "I've suspected her for a long time." She looks at the young master with a strange gaze. Sir Ricci. Obsessive, unhinged, like she wants to steal him. "What are you saying?" Matteo asked, his voice steady but his eyes darkening. "You didn't know?" Veronica pressed on, her tone growing more dramatic by the second. "That girl lost her child 6 weeks ago. Her husband left her. She lost everything. A woman like that, who loses her child and is pushed to the bottom of society, do you think her mind is still normal? She craves a baby. She looks at the young master like he's her own child. I've seen her hovering near the nursery several times, pretending to clean but really spying on the baby." Veronica stood and moved closer to Matteo, her concern flawlessly performed. "I didn't dare say anything, because I was afraid you'd think I was making things up. But tonight, when I got back, I saw the light in the nursery. I was about to check when you appeared. Sir Ricci, you have to be careful with that girl. She lost her child. She's gone mad. Who knows what she might do to the young master?" Matteo remained silent, But Veronica's words seeped into his mind like poison. He remembered Eliza's eyes when she looked at Leo. Pain-filled, hungry, loving to a frightening degree. He remembered the way she held his son, as if the child were hers, as if she had a right. In Mateo's world, no one did anything without a purpose. No one sacrificed without demanding something in return. Eliza had said she saved his son because she couldn't watch a child die. But what if that was a lie? What if she truly wanted to take his son? What if she was a threat he hadn't recognized yet? Veronica saw the spark of doubt ignite in Mateo's eyes and knew she had won. She lowered her head, hiding her venomous smile behind a mask of worry. The floor cleaner would pay the price in her place, and Veronica would continue her game, with no one left to stop her. Mateo stood motionless in the middle of the grand hall, his cold gray eyes staring into empty space. Veronica's words still echoed in his mind like an alarm bell that refused to fade. He had lived in the underworld long enough to know that no one was kind without conditions. Every action carried a motive. Every sacrifice demanded a price. And the woman named Eliza had crossed a line that was far too great, far too intimate, far too personal to be explained by simple kindness. He remembered the way she had looked at Leo. That gaze wasn't the look of a servant at her employer's child. It was the look of a mother staring at her own. And that made his skin crawl. His son wasn't her son. His son was his blood. The only legacy Isabella had left behind before she was gone forever. He couldn't allow anyone to threaten the most precious thing left in his life. Tony. Mateo spoke at last, his voice low and cold as stone. Get rid of her. Immediately, Tony hesitated for a fraction of a second but didn't dare question him. After all these years working for Mateo, he had learned that when his boss gave an order, there was only one thing to do. Yes, sir. Anything else? Don't let her take anything with her. Don't let her say a single word. I don't want to see her face again. Tony nodded and turned away, leaving Mateo alone in the darkened hall. Veronica was still standing there, hiding her triumphant smile behind a mask of concern. She lowered her head and quietly slipped back into the shadows, returning to her room to savor her victory. In the basement, inside the tiny room reserved for the staff, Eliza was sunk in an exhausted sleep. She hadn't slept for 2 days, working non-stop to earn extra money to pay off her debt. Tonight, after saving baby Leo, her body had finally collapsed from sheer exhaustion. She was dreaming of her son. In the dream, he was still alive, nursing in her arms, his eyes wide open and filled with absolute trust as he looked at her. She smiled, tears of happiness streaming down her cheeks. Then the pounding on the door shattered the dream. Eliza jolted awake, panic flooding her as she struggled to understand what was happening. The door flew open and Tony stepped inside, his face cold and unreadable. Pack your things. You're fired. Get out of here in 10 minutes. Eliza froze, her mind still foggy with sleep, unable to grasp what she was hearing. She looked at Tony, searching his face for an explanation, but found only indifference. Why? What did I do wrong? I only saved the baby. There's no explanation. Those are the boss's orders. Tony cut her off, his voice unchanging. Leave now, or I'll have to use force. It felt as if someone had punched Eliza in the chest. She had saved his son's life. She had risked her own life so baby Leo wouldn't die alone and starving. And this was how she was repaid? Thrown out like a criminal? Not even given a chance to explain? Please let me see Mr. Ricci, Eliza said as she stood, her voice breaking in desperation. I need to talk to him. I need him to understand. The boss doesn't want to see you. Tony grabbed Eliza by the arm and dragged her out of the room. You've got nothing to pack. Let's go. Eliza struggled, but Tony's grip was like iron. She was pulled down the dark hallway, past the luxurious rooms she had cleaned day after day, past the front door she had once walked through with hope for a stable job. Now she was thrown out like something worthless. When the door slammed shut behind her, Eliza stood frozen in the night. Rain began to fall, icy drops striking her face like slaps. She looked down and realized she hadn't even had time to put on her shoes. Her bare feet stood on the freezing stone, not a single coin to her name, not a single person she could call. She had once thought her life couldn't possibly get any worse. She had been wrong. Fate still had far more suffering in store for her. And tonight was only the beginning. Rain poured down like a waterfall, turning the night into a curtain of black water that couldn't be seen through. Eliza walked along the road leading away from the estate, her bare feet striking the icy asphalt, cut and scraped by sharp gravel. Every step tore at her flesh, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. If she stopped, she would collapse completely. Her clothes were soaked within seconds, clinging to her thin body like a second skin. Freezing rain seeped into every fiber of her being, mixing with the hot tears streaming down her face. She didn't know whether she was crying or if it was just the rain anymore. Maybe it didn't matter. She passed through the massive iron gates of the Ricci estate, where the guards looked at her with the same indifference they would give a stray dog chased from its owner's yard. No one asked if she was all right. No one offered her an umbrella or a pair of shoes. In this world, she was nothing more than a meaningless speck of dust, blown away without anyone caring. Eliza kept walking, on and on through the rain that lashed like whips. She didn't know where she was going. Her shabby rented room was more than 10 miles away, and she didn't have money for a taxi. She didn't have a phone because she'd sold it to pay hospital debts. She didn't have anyone to call even if she had one. All she had were her bare feet and a heart shattered into a million pieces. Images of baby Leo filled her mind, his lips nursing in her arms, his tiny hands gripping her blouse, his peaceful face as he drifted into sleep. She had saved him. She had risked her life so he wouldn't die hungry and alone. And what had she gotten in return? She'd been thrown into the street like a criminal, cast into the darkness like a piece of trash. Why? Eliza screamed into the rain, her voice swallowed by howling wind and rolling thunder. Why does life treat me like this? What did I do wrong? No one answered. There was only rain, wind, and endless darkness. She kept going, her feet beginning to bleed as gravel sliced into her skin. She couldn't feel the pain anymore, because her entire body had gone numb. Uncontrollable shivers ran through her, waves of cold rising from her spine. She remembered the night Ryan had thrown her out while she was 7 months pregnant. The rain had been just like this, the cold just like this, the loneliness and despair just like this. That night, she'd slipped on the stairs and fallen, and the baby inside her had suffered the first shock that later led to his premature birth. Tonight, maybe fate was finishing what it had started back then. Eliza's foot slipped into a deep puddle. She lost her balance and fell hard onto the road. Her knee slammed into stone, blood mixing with the rain. She tried to push herself up, but her arms had no strength left. She lay there, in the middle of the empty road, beneath a storm that seemed intent on tearing the world apart. She stared up at the black sky, rain striking her face like slaps. "My child," she whispered, her voice so weak the wind could carry it away. "Mommy's coming to you. Please wait for me." Her eyes slowly closed. She felt her consciousness drifting, sinking into a darkness that felt softer and warmer than the freezing rain around her. Maybe dying would be better. Maybe in the other world she'd see her son again. Maybe there would be no more pain there, no more betrayal, no more being treated like trash. She was ready to let go. Then hands grabbed her shoulders. "My God, the girl," a familiar voice rang out, filled with worry and panic. Eliza forced her eyes open and saw the wrinkled face of Martha, the elderly housekeeper of the Ricci estate, bending over her with tear-filled eyes. Martha wore a raincoat and held a flashlight, her old truck parked by the roadside with its headlights still on. "Child, how did it come to this?" Martha pulled Eliza up and helped her into the truck. "I heard you were thrown out, so I came looking for you. My God, your feet are bleeding everywhere." Eliza wanted to speak, but her lips were numb and wouldn't move. She could only cry, crying like she never had before, in the arms of the old woman she'd barely ever spoken to. "It's all right, child." Martha held her close, her voice trembling. "You saved the baby. You're a good person. God won't abandon you." Martha brought Eliza back to her rented room in the slums of South Chicago. The room was smaller than a closet in the Ricci estate, its walls stained with spreading mold and its ceiling leaking whenever it rained. The old woman helped Eliza change into dry clothes, covered her with the only thin blanket in the room, left a little money and some food on the table, then left after promising she'd come back to check on her. Eliza lay motionless on the creaking old bed, listening to the rain hammer against the tin roof like unending war drums. Her body burned as if on fire, a high fever raging inside her after hours soaked in freezing rain. She wanted water but didn't have the strength to sit up. She wanted food but her stomach clenched in pain and rejected everything. All she could do was lie there, sinking into delirium, the line between reality and nightmare blurring until she couldn't tell them apart. In the fever, the past came rushing back like a flood. Eliza saw herself standing in the old apartment where she'd lived with Ryan through 3 years of hellish marriage. She saw his face, handsome and charming when they first met, then twisting into a monster whenever he drank. She saw his fist rise and crash down again and again, The first time he hit her was 3 months after the wedding. He was drunk, irrationally jealous, grabbing her hair and slapping her to the floor. The next morning he'd knelt down, crying and swearing he'd never do it again. She believed him. She was naive enough to believe love could change a man. But there was a second time, then a third, then countless times she couldn't even remember anymore. He beat her when the food didn't please him. He beat her when she came home a few minutes late. He beat her when she looked at another man, even by accident. He beat her because he wanted to, because he could, because she had no one to run to. She'd been an orphan since the age of 12, raised in foster homes, with no family, no friends, no one on her side. Ryan knew that. He used her loneliness to control her completely. Eliza shifted on the bed as the fever worsened, pulling her deeper into delirium. She saw herself pregnant, her belly heavy at 7 months, the only hope keeping her alive. She thought a baby would change everything. She thought Ryan would become a good father. She thought her small family would be happy. She was wrong. That night, Ryan came home drunk out of his mind, screaming for money. She said there was none. He kicked her straight in the stomach. One kick. Just one. But it was enough to destroy everything. She fell down the stairs, tumbling step after step, clutching her belly in desperation. She was taken to the hospital, doctors trying to save the pregnancy but failing. Her son was born at 7 months, tiny and fragile, his lungs not fully developed, his heart fluttering weakly like a dying butterfly. He lived for 2 days. 2 days was all she had. 2 days watching him through the glass of an incubator. 2 days listening to machines sustain his fragile life. Then the machines fell silent, and her child was gone forever. Eliza screamed in her delirium, her cries echoing through the empty room where no one could hear. She saw Ryan standing beside the hospital bed, his face cold as ice, his mouth spitting venom. "You killed my son. You're useless. You don't deserve to be a mother." Then he disappeared, leaving her with crushing hospital debt and a heart that had died. Eliza opened her eyes, drenched in sweat, tears mixing with water dripping from the ceiling onto her face. She didn't know how long she'd been lying there. 1 day, 2 days. She didn't care anymore. The food Martha had left sat untouched on the table, already starting to smell. The water bottle was long empty. She was hungry. She was thirsty. She was in so much pain she wanted to die. But she couldn't die. Fate wouldn't let her go that easily. It wanted her to endure more, to suffer more, to be wrung dry to the very last tear. Her chest throbbed with painful fullness. Milk still coming in, though there was no one to feed. She had to express it herself, watching the cloudy white liquid spill onto the filthy floor, wasted like her own life. She thought of baby Leo. She wondered if he was all right. She wondered if anyone was feeding him. She wondered if he still remembered her warmth. That was her last thought before she slipped back into darkness once more. While Eliza lay lost in a feverish haze in her miserable rented room, the Ricci estate was slipping into chaos of its own. Baby Leo began crying again the very next morning after Eliza was thrown out. His cries echoed through the mansion, piercing every wall, seeping into every room, impossible to silence. Veronica tried feeding him with a bottle, but he turned his head away, his tiny lips pressed tight in refusal. She switched to a different formula, and he still wouldn't take it. She tried giving him water, and he cried even louder. He cried until his voice grew hoarse, cried until his strength ran out, then lay still with his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling as if searching for something that had vanished. Matteo stood outside the nursery door, listening to his son cry, unable to step inside. He had grown accustomed to avoiding this room ever since Isabella died. Every time he looked at Leo, he saw his wife's eyes staring back at him from that tiny face. The pain was too great. He hadn't been brave enough to face it. But now, that crying was tearing into him in a different way. On the second day, Leo stopped crying, not because he had calmed down, but because he no longer had the strength to cry. He lay motionless in the crib, his skin pale, his lips cracked and dry, his eyes dull and lifeless. He refused everything placed in his mouth, even sugar water. His small body began to dehydrate severely. Veronica panicked and called Dr. Harrison Webb to examine him, the elderly physician with snow-white hair who had served the Ricci family for 20 years. He examined Leo in silence, his expression growing heavier with each passing minute. When he stepped out of the nursery, Matteo was already waiting in the hallway, the gray eyes of the Mafia boss revealing, for the first time, an anxiety he couldn't hide. "How is my son?" Matteo asked. his voice hoarse after 2 sleepless nights. Dr. Harrison sighed and shook his head slowly. I don't understand it, Mr. Ricci. Physically, there's nothing seriously wrong. No infection, no underlying illness, but he's refusing all food and drink. He's starving himself. Why? Matteo asked urgently. Why would my son do that? Dr. Harrison was silent for a moment before answering. Sometimes infants form a very strong attachment to a specific caregiver. When that person disappears suddenly, the child can fall into extreme stress and refuse everything from others. What do you call that? Matteo asked. Infant loss response, the doctor said, looking straight into Matteo's eyes. I heard there was a woman who took care of him the night before. Where is she now? Matteo didn't answer. His jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He thought of Eliza, remembered the way she held his son, remembered the peaceful look on Leo's face in her arms. He had thrown her out. He had believed the words of a poisonous snake and driven away the only person who had brought his son peace. Mr. Ricci, I'll be direct, Dr. Harrison continued, his tone grave. If this continues for a few more days, the baby will become critically dehydrated. We can use IV fluids to sustain him, but that's only a temporary solution. He needs to be fed properly. He needs the person he trusts. If we can't find that person, I can't guarantee anything. Matteo felt as if someone had punched him straight in the chest. He walked into the nursery and looked down at the crib where his son lay. Leo was so small he looked as if he might fade away at any moment. His skin so translucent the tiny blue veins beneath were visible. His eyes were half closed, his breathing weak, his little fists clenched as if desperately holding on to something that was no longer there. Matteo knelt beside the crib, and for the first time in his life, the Mafia boss felt utterly powerless. He could kill dozens of enemies without blinking. He could rule an entire underworld through ruthlessness and calculation. But he couldn't save his son. He couldn't force him to eat. He couldn't make him stop searching for the arms that had held him that night. My son, I'm sorry, Matteo whispered, his voice trembling. I'll fix everything. I promise. Tony Marchetti had never trusted Veronica Hayes. From the first day she stepped into the Ricci estate with her blue eyes and seductive smile, he'd felt something was wrong. The instincts of a man who'd survived in the underworld for more than 10 years warned him that this woman was far more dangerous than her beautiful appearance suggested. So, after the night Eliza was thrown out, Tony quietly began watching Veronica. He wanted to know why she'd been so eager to frame an innocent housemaid. He wanted to know what she was hiding. And on the 3rd night, as baby Leo grew weaker in his crib, Tony finally found his answer. He stood outside Veronica's door, ear pressed to the narrow crack, listening as she spoke on the phone with someone. Her voice was nothing like the sweet, pitiable tone she used around Matteo. It was cold and calculating, like a venomous snake. Everything's going exactly according to plan, Veronica said, her voice thick with satisfaction. The little cleaning girl has been kicked out. The new nanny they hired can't do a thing. The baby's seriously ill, and Matteo Ricci is completely distracted. This is the perfect moment to strike. Tony held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He heard a man's voice on the other end say something. Then Veronica let out a soft laugh. Of course, Mr. Benedetti. I'll send you the estate's security layout tonight. The guards' schedules, the main gate codes, the locations of Matteo's bedroom and the baby's room. I have it all. You just need to bring your people in. After Matteo's dead, you'll keep your promise, right? $5 million and a villa in Miami. Tony had heard enough. He slipped back silently, his steps light as a cat's, then rushed straight to Matteo's study. He didn't knock, pushing the door open and startling the Mafia boss, who was sitting beside his son's bed. Boss, we've got a serious problem, Tony said, his breath coming fast. Veronica Hayes is a spy for Carlo Benedetti. She's selling him information. Matteo shot to his feet, his gray eyes darkening with a surge of fury. What did you say? Tony recounted everything he'd heard, word for word, leaving nothing out. By the time he finished, Matteo's face had become a death mask. He didn't shout or scream. He stood there in terrifying silence, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. When did she come here? Matteo asked, his voice low and cold as a tomb. 3 months ago, sir, Tony replied, right after the madam passed away. Matteo closed his eyes. Everything began falling into place. Benedetti had planted Veronica in his house from the start, exploiting the moment when he was grieving and least alert. She'd spent 3 months gathering information, waiting for the right time, And that night, she'd deliberately neglected baby Leo to create chaos. She'd framed Eliza to drive out the one person who could save his son. It had all been a carefully calculated scheme. What about the cleaning girl? Matteo opened his eyes and looked at Tony. What did she say about Eliza? Tony hesitated for a second before answering. I looked into it again. Sir, Eliza Monroe has no connection to Benedetti or any other gang. She's just an ordinary woman who lost her child 6 weeks ago. Her ex-husband was an abuser who disappeared. She worked here to pay off hospital debt. That night, she saved the young master's life, and we threw her out like a criminal. Matteo felt as if acid had been poured into his chest. He'd been wrong. He'd believed a traitor and driven his son's savior into the street in the middle of a storm. He was the most ruthless mafia boss in Chicago. Yet he'd been fooled by a poisonous snake like a fool. Take Veronica to the basement, Matteo ordered, his voice utterly devoid of emotion. I want to know everything she's told Benedetti. After that, find Eliza Monroe. Find her no matter what and bring her back here. Tony nodded and disappeared into the darkness of the hallway. Matteo stood alone in the room, looking down at his son lying weakly in the crib. He'd made the greatest mistake of his life. And now he had to fix it before it was too late. The underground chamber beneath the Ricci estate was a place that made even the hardest criminals tremble. The room was built of reinforced concrete, completely soundproof, so that not a single scream could escape. This was where Matteo dealt with traitors, with those who dared challenge his authority. And tonight, Veronica Hayes was kneeling on the cold concrete floor, her hands bound tightly behind her back, her golden blonde hair matted with blood from the wound on her head when Tony had dragged her down here. Matteo stepped into the chamber, his leather shoes striking the floor with steady footsteps like a funeral drum. He stopped in front of Veronica and looked down at her, his gaze colder than the concrete walls surrounding them. Veronica lifted her head, trying to force out the seductive smile she always wore, but it collapsed miserably. All the arrogance was gone from her face, replaced by absolute terror. Mr. Ricci, please let me explain, she stammered, her voice shaking. I was forced. Benedetti threatened to kill my family if I didn't cooperate. I had no other choice. Matteo said nothing. He signaled to Tony, and the loyal bodyguard stepped forward, a pair of iron pliers in his hand. Veronica saw the tool and began to scream. No, please don't. I'll confess everything. I'll tell you everything. Please don't hurt me. Matteo remained silent and nodded for Tony to continue. The sound of metal clamping down on Veronica's finger rang out, followed by a piercing scream. 1, 2, 3. After 15 minutes, Veronica had confessed to everything. She hadn't been forced at all. She'd contacted Carlo Benedetti of her own accord 6 months earlier, offering to act as a spy in exchange for $5 million and a life of luxury. She'd been planted in the Ricci estate under the guise of a nanny, exploiting the moment right after Isabella's death, when Matteo was drowning in grief and least vigilant. Her mission was to gather information about the security system, Matteo's movements, and to wait for the right moment for Benedetti to strike. That night, she deliberately neglected baby Leo to create chaos inside the estate. She hadn't expected Eliza to appear and save the baby. When she realized what had happened, she immediately devised a plan to frame Eliza, both to cover up her own negligence and to eliminate an unexpected variable that could ruin everything. Everything she'd said about Eliza had been a lie. That cleaning girl never had any intentions toward the young master. Veronica sobbed, blood from her crushed fingers dripping onto the concrete floor. She only wanted to save the baby. But I was afraid you'd discover I neglected my duties, Mr. Ricci, so I put all the blame on her. I lied. Everything was a lie. Matteo felt the fury burning in his chest, but he forced it down. He turned his back and walked out of the chamber, leaving Veronica for Tony to handle. He didn't need to know how it would end for her. Traitors didn't deserve his concern. As Matteo climbed the stairs, he saw Martha standing at the end of the hallway, waiting for him. The elderly housekeeper, with snow-white hair and kind eyes, had served the Ricci family since before Matteo was born. She was the only person in the estate who dared speak honestly to him without fear of consequence. Sir, I need to tell you something, Martha said, her voice trembling with worry, though her gaze remained steady. Matteo stopped and looked at her wearily. Go on. It's about the girl, Eliza. Martha stepped closer, lowering her voice as if afraid someone might overhear. The night you threw her out, I drove out to look for her. I found her unconscious in the middle of the road, barefoot and bleeding, soaked to the bone. I took her back to her rented room in the southern slums. Mateo felt as if a knife had been driven straight into his chest. She lives in the slums? Martha nodded, tears beginning to roll down her wrinkled cheeks. Her room isn't even fit for a dog, sir. Moldy walls, a leaking ceiling, rats everywhere. She worked here to pay off hospital debt after her child died. Her husband beat her for 3 years and then disappeared, leaving her with debt and a shattered heart. Martha paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. She lost her newborn son just 6 weeks before she came here, sir. The baby only lived for 2 days after being born prematurely because his own father kicked his mother in the stomach. She buried her child alone, with no one beside her. And when she heard the young master crying that night, she ran upstairs to save him, even though she knew she could lose her life. She had no ulterior motive, sir. She was just a mother who'd lost her child and couldn't bear to watch another baby die in front of her. Mateo stood frozen like stone, each of Martha's words striking his conscience like a hammer. He'd thrown a woman like that into the street in the middle of a violent storm. He'd treated his son's savior like a criminal. He was a monster. How is she now? Mateo asked, his voice hoarse. Martha shook her head, tears flowing more freely. I don't know, sir. I meant to go back and check on her, but the work here became overwhelming. I'm terrified. She had a high fever when I left her. She was so weak. I'm afraid she won't survive. Mateo didn't wait another second. He summoned all his men and issued orders in a voice that allowed no argument. Find Eliza Monroe. Mobilize everyone. Search every alley, every rented room in the southern slums of Chicago. Find her no matter what, and report back to me immediately. His subordinates exchanged stunned looks. They had never seen their boss care about a servant like this. But no one dared ask a question. In Matteo Ricci's world, orders were absolute. They scattered at once, dozens of black cars tearing into the night like a pack of hunting wolves. Tony stepped up beside Matteo, his voice cautious. Sir, you should stay and take care of the young master. Let us handle this. Matteo shook his head, his eyes fixed on some distant point as if he were seeing something no one else could see. No, I have to go. I have to find her myself. Tony wanted to say more, but stopped when he saw the look on his boss's face. It wasn't the expression of a mafia boss issuing commands. It was the face of a man tortured by guilt, desperately trying to make amends before it was too late. They got into the car and plunged into the darkness. Matteo sat in the back seat, watching the streets of Chicago slide past the window. From the luxurious suburban estates, they moved toward the city center, then deeper into areas even the police hesitated to enter. The southern slums unfolded before him like another world. Crumbling old buildings piled against one another, shattered windows patched with cardboard and plastic bags. Trash overflowed onto the sidewalks, the stench forcing its way in even through closed car doors. Homeless figures huddled in dark corners, gaunt children rummaging through garbage for food. Matteo had lived in Chicago his entire life, but he'd never set foot in a place like this. He knew it existed. He knew thousands lived in extreme poverty, but he'd never truly seen it. His world was luxury mansions, expensive cars, million-dollar parties, and this was Eliza's world. This was where she returned after hours of scrubbing floors in his estate. This was where she'd stumbled back through a violent storm after he'd thrown her out. Matteo felt his throat tighten. Martha had given them Eliza's address, a decaying 3-story building at the end of a dark alley. Tony led the way, Matteo following behind, his expensive leather shoes stepping into filthy puddles and piles of trash he didn't even notice. Second floor, room 7. That was what Martha had said. They climbed the rotten wooden stairs that groaned under every step. The hallway was pitch black, lit by a single flickering bulb that looked ready to die at any moment. The smell of damp rot and urine made Tony grimace. But Matteo didn't slow down. They stopped in front of door number 7. Tony knocked, but there was no answer. He knocked again, harder. Still silence. Matteo lost patience. He shoved Tony aside and kicked the door himself. The rotting wood gave way after a single blow, bursting open to reveal the room inside. And what Matteo saw froze him at the threshold. The room was smaller than a bathroom in his estate. The walls were smeared with dark green mold, the ceiling gaping with a large hole where rainwater still dripped steadily onto the floor. An ancient bed with a paper-thin mattress sat in the corner. There was no refrigerator, no stove, nothing except a broken plastic chair and a plastic bucket catching the leaking water. And on that bed, Eliza lay motionless. Her body was curled beneath a flimsy blanket, dark brown hair plastered to her sweat-soaked forehead. Her face was ashen like a corpse, her lips cracked and dry, her breathing so faint her chest barely moved. Eliza. Matteo breathed her name, his voice a broken whisper. He rushed to the bedside and dropped to his knees on the filthy floor without hesitation. He reached out and touched her forehead, then recoiled as if burned. Her skin was hot like live embers. She was dying from a raging fever and exhaustion, alone in this wretched room with no one knowing. "Call Dr. Harrison immediately," Matteo ordered, his voice trembling for the first time in his life. "And get the car ready. I'm taking her back to the estate." Matteo didn't wait another second. He bent down, slid his arms beneath Eliza's frail body, and lifted her up. She was so light it terrified him, light like a dried leaf, as if most of her life had already slipped away. He held her against his chest, feeling the fever scorching her body seep through the expensive fabric of his suit. Her head lolled against his shoulder, dark brown hair plastered with sweat framing a face pale as death. She didn't react when he picked her up, didn't stir, didn't moan, just lay limp in his arms like an abandoned cloth doll. Matteo moved quickly out of the wretched room, through the foul-smelling hallway, down the rotting stairs. Tony ran ahead to open the car door, and the most ruthless mafia boss in Chicago stepped into the vehicle with a dying woman in his arms without looking back even once. He sat in the back seat, resting Eliza's head on his thigh, one arm holding her steady as the car tore through the night. This was the first time Matteo had held a woman like this since Isabella died. He looked down at Eliza's ashen face and noticed scars he'd never seen before. A faint mark on her wrist, the trace of rope burns. An old bruise turned yellow at her temple, cracks on her dry lips from days without food or water. How much pain had she endured before ever setting foot in his estate? How many hells had she survived that he'd never known about? And he had added to her suffering by throwing her into the street like a stray dog. "Eliza, can you hear me?" Matteo whispered, his voice hoarse as if someone were crushing his throat. "You have to live. Do you hear me? You're not allowed to die. I won't let you die." Eliza didn't answer. She drifted in delirium, her breathing faint like a candle in the wind, ready to go out at any moment. Matteo held her tighter, as if his arms alone could anchor her to this world. But he knew they couldn't. He could kill dozens of enemies. He could command an entire criminal empire, but he couldn't order death to stop. The car raced toward the estate at a reckless speed, Tony driving like a man possessed through the empty Chicago streets at midnight. When they arrived, Dr. Harrison was already waiting at the front entrance with a medical team and emergency equipment. Matteo carried Eliza out of the car and straight inside, not stopping to explain a thing. "Take her to the living room," Dr. Harrison instructed his team. "Prepare IV fluids and fever-reducing medication immediately." They laid Eliza on the long sofa, and the doctor began a rapid examination. He checked her pulse, measured her blood pressure, shone a light into her eyes. His expression grew more grave with every passing second. Matteo stood beside them, his hands clenched into fists, his eyes never leaving Eliza for a moment. "How is she?" he asked, his voice stretched tight like a wire about to snap. "Her condition is very serious, Mr. Ricci," Dr. Harrison replied, as he injected medication into Eliza's vein. "Prolonged high fever, severe dehydration, acute malnutrition. She hasn't been eating or drinking properly for days. Her body is at its absolute limit." "Will she survive?" Matteo asked, and for the first time in his life, real fear crept into his voice. "I'll do everything I can," Dr. Harrison said, meeting his gaze, "but she's extremely weak. The next few hours will decide everything. All we can do now is wait and pray." Matteo wasn't a man who believed in God. He'd lived in darkness for too long, his hands stained with too much blood to imagine someone above watching over him. But tonight, he found himself praying. He sat down in the chair beside Eliza, watching her lie there with the IV line in her arm, an oxygen mask covering her nose and mouth, the heart monitor beeping steadily. He remembered the night Isabella died, how he'd sat like this, watching his wife slip away while he could do nothing. He couldn't let it happen again. He couldn't lose another woman because of his own mistakes. "Eliza, I'm sorry," Matteo whispered, his hand closing around her ice-cold fingers. "I treated you cruelly. I believed a traitor and threw you away like trash. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but please live. Please give me a chance to make it right. Please open your eyes." Eliza remained still, without any response. But on the monitor, her heart rate began to steady, as if somewhere far away, she could hear him calling her back. 2 days passed like 2 centuries. Matteo didn't leave Eliza's room for a single moment. He sat in the chair beside her bed for 48 continuous hours, without sleep, without food, doing nothing but watching her breathe and praying for her to wake up. A few doors away in the nursery, the rest of the medical team worked tirelessly to keep baby Leo from slipping away. Since the infant still refused to take a bottle, Dr. Harrison kept him on a continuous drip of IV fluids to provide essential hydration and nutrients, desperate to stabilize his fragile system until the only woman he trusted could return to him. Dr. Harrison came to examine her every few hours, reporting that the fever had broken and the dehydration was under control, but she still hadn't regained consciousness. The elderly doctor said her body needed time to recover from damage that severe, both physical and emotional. Mateo only nodded, his eyes never leaving Eliza's pale face. He watched her lying there, dark brown hair spread across the white pillow, lips pink again but still tightly closed, eyes shut as if lost in a distant dream. He wondered what she was dreaming about. Was she dreaming of her son? Was she somewhere without pain, without betrayal, without cruel men like her former husband, and like himself? On the morning of the third day, when the first sunlight slipped through the curtains and filled the room, Mateo saw Eliza's eyelashes tremble. He sat up straight, his heart pounding violently in his chest. She stirred slightly, her lips moving as if trying to say something. Then slowly, very slowly, her eyes opened. Blue-gray eyes stared up at the ceiling in confusion, then gradually came back into focus. Eliza blinked several times, trying to understand where she was. She saw the high ceiling with crystal chandeliers, cream-colored walls adorned with expensive paintings, deep red velvet curtains. This wasn't her miserable rented room. This was the Ricci estate. She tried to sit up, but her body was too weak, her hands shaking as they failed to support her. Then she turned her head and froze when she saw Matteo Ricci sitting beside her bed. The Mafia boss looked nothing like the last time she'd seen him. His beard was several days unshaven, his eyes sunken from lack of sleep, his clothes wrinkled as if he'd been wearing them for days. But what stunned her most were his eyes. They were no longer cold and merciless like the night he threw her out, but filled with pain and remorse. "Where am I?" Eliza asked, her voice hoarse from days of silence. "Why am I here?" Matteo didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly stood from the chair, and then did something Eliza never imagined he would do. He knelt beside her bed, his head bowed low, broad shoulders trembling as if carrying the weight of the entire world. "Eliza, I'm sorry," Matteo said, his voice deep and broken with emotion. "I was wrong. I believed a traitor and threw you out like a criminal. You saved my son's life, and I treated you like trash. I'm a monster. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I still had to say I'm sorry, whether you accept it or not." Eliza stared at the feared Mafia boss kneeling at her bedside, unable to believe her eyes. This was the man all of Chicago feared, the man who killed without blinking, the man who held the power of life and death over thousands, and he was kneeling before her, a cleaning woman with nothing but calloused hands and a shattered heart. But Eliza didn't think about that. She didn't think about the apology, didn't think about the nights she'd nearly died in her miserable room, didn't think about the injustice she'd endured. She thought of only one thing. "How is the baby?" Eliza asked anxiously. "Is Leo all right? Has something happened to him?" Matteo lifted his head, his eyes widening in surprise. She'd just survived the edge of death. She'd been thrown into the street like a criminal. She'd nearly died of fever and exhaustion. And the first thing she asked wasn't about herself, but about his son. "Leo hasn't eaten since you left," Matteo replied, his voice thick with emotion. "He refuses everything. The doctor says he's growing weaker from starving himself. He needs you, Eliza. He needs only you." Tears flooded Eliza's eyes and streamed down her gaunt cheeks. She tried to sit up, her body still weak but her will stronger than ever. "Take me to him," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Please take me to him right now." Matteo stood and gently helped Eliza from the bed. She didn't have the strength to walk, so he lifted her into his arms, careful as if holding something priceless and fragile. He carried her to the nursery, where baby Leo lay barely alive in his crib, an IV line attached to his tiny hand. When Eliza saw him, she broke down, sobbing. She reached out, and Matteo understood, placing her in the rocking chair beside the crib. Eliza bent down and lifted baby Leo with trembling arms. He was much lighter than the night she saved him, his skin pale and so translucent that tiny blue veins were visible beneath it. But when he settled into Eliza's arms, a miracle happened. His eyes opened and looked up at her, and his tiny lips began to move, searching. He recognized her. He remembered her warmth, Eliza cried and smiled at the same time, holding him to her chest and nursing him like that first night. Leo latched on immediately, eager and strong, as if he'd been waiting for this moment for days. Matteo stood in the doorway, watching the scene with tears in his eyes. He saw his son come back to life in the arms of the woman he'd nearly destroyed. He saw a miracle unfolding before him, and he knew he'd do anything, absolutely anything, to protect these two people for the rest of his life. 1 week passed in a fragile, borrowed calm. Eliza stayed at the Ricci estate to care for baby Leo, no longer as a servant, but as an honored guest of the master of the house. She was given a private room right beside the nursery. New clothes, proper meals, everything she needed. Baby Leo recovered with miraculous speed. He nursed regularly, slept peacefully, and began to laugh out loud whenever Eliza held him. Matteo often came to the nursery, standing silently in the doorway, watching the two of them with an expression Eliza couldn't decipher. He didn't speak much, yet his presence made her feel safe in a way she couldn't explain. But peace never lasted. Carlo Benedetti realized his plot had been exposed when Veronica vanished. He knew Matteo would hunt him down, so he chose to strike first. On the 7th night, while the entire estate lay asleep, hell descended. The first explosion thundered from the main gate, sharp and violent, ripping apart the quiet night. Then gunfire erupted, rapid and relentless, as if an entire army were storming the estate. Eliza jolted awake, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. She heard screams, running footsteps, shattering glass. Survival instinct took over and she rushed straight into Leo's room. The baby was screaming in terror, his tiny face flushed red, little hands flailing in the air, searching for protection. Eliza scooped him up and pressed him tightly to her chest, one hand shielding his head as if her body could stop bullets. The door burst open and Tony charged in, gun in hand, his face tense. "Follow me now," he ordered urgently. "Benedetti is attacking. The boss is fighting downstairs. I have to get you and the little master to the safe room." Eliza didn't think. She clutched Leo and ran after Tony through the darkened corridors. The gunfire grew closer. She heard bullets slam into walls, men screaming, glass exploding. The smell of gunpowder and blood spread through the air. She'd never experienced anything like this. She was just an ordinary woman, a mother who'd lost her child, a survivor of domestic abuse. She knew nothing about gang wars, about guns, about death lurking in every shadow. But she knew one thing: she'd protect the baby in her arms at any cost. Tony led her to a hidden room concealed behind a bookshelf in the library. He pushed her inside and pressed a handgun into her hand. "Stay here and don't come out no matter what happens," he said quickly. "If anyone who isn't one of us comes in, shoot." Then he was gone. The hidden door closed, leaving Eliza alone in the small room with Leo crying and the cold weight of the gun in her hand. She sank into a corner, back against the wall, holding Leo to her chest. She softly sang the lullaby she used to sing to her own son, her voice trembling but steady, trying to calm him amid the gunfire outside. "Shh, my love. It's all right," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mommy's here. Mommy won't let anyone touch you. I swear I'll protect you." Outside the safe room, Matteo fought like a cornered beast, a pistol in his right hand, a dagger in his left. He moved through the grand hall with the precision and brutality of a man accustomed to killing. Benedetti's men poured in from every direction, but he cut them down one by one, without blinking, without hesitation. Blood splattered the walls, the marble floors, his expensive suit. He didn't care. He thought only of Eliza and Leo in the safe room. All he had to do was keep the enemy from reaching them. A bullet tore through his left shoulder, blood soaking his shirt. He staggered but didn't fall, teeth clenched, fighting on. One of Benedetti's men rushed him from behind. Matteo spun and fired point blank into the man's chest. The body dropped and Matteo stepped over it like discarded trash. The battle lasted over an hour. When the final gunshot faded, the grand hall of the Ricci estate had become a battlefield. Benedetti's men lay scattered everywhere, blood pooling across the marble floor. Tony reported that Carlo Benedetti had fled when he realized his forces were losing, but he wouldn't escape for long. Matteo nodded, then staggered toward the library. His shoulder wound still bled, but he didn't care. He needed to know Eliza and Leo were safe. When the hidden door opened, Matteo saw Eliza huddled in the corner, clutching Leo tightly, the gun still shaking in her hand. She looked up at him, eyes red from crying, filled with overwhelming relief when she saw he was alive. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice breaking. "You're hurt." Matteo knelt before her, one hand reaching up to touch her cheek. the other gently brushing Leo's head. Blood dripped from his shoulder onto the floor. But he smiled. The first real smile Eliza had ever seen from him. "I'm fine," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion yet warm. "As long as you two are safe, that's all that matters." After that horrifying night, everything changed. Carlo Benedetti was hunted down and eliminated by Tony and the crew just 3 days after the attack, ending the greatest threat to the Ricci family. The estate was repaired. Bullet holes in the walls were patched. The marble floors once soaked in blood were scrubbed clean and polished. But what had changed inside people's hearts couldn't be erased. Matteo was no longer the cold, distant mafia boss he'd once been. He began spending time with his son, learning how to hold him, how to rock him to sleep, how to change diapers. His hands, once used to holding guns, now clumsy like a child learning to walk for the first time. Eliza stood beside him, guiding him, and every time their hands brushed by accident while passing a bottle or settling Leo into the crib, she felt a jolt run straight down her spine. She tried to ignore it. Who was she to even think about love with the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago? She was just a woman who'd lost her child, survived abuse, and had nothing but worn hands and a shattered heart. But Matteo didn't let her see herself that way. He began having breakfast with her and Leo every morning, sitting at the head of the long table in the elegant dining room, yet his eyes were always on her. He asked about her life, about the dreams she'd once had, about the books she loved to read, about her favorite flowers. He listened to her for hours, without ever seeming bored or impatient. One evening, after Leo had fallen asleep, Matteo invited Eliza into the garden to look at the stars. They sat on a stone bench beneath the rose trellis, moonlight spilling across her face, and Matteo couldn't look away. She told him about her past, about growing up an orphan in foster homes, about the years Ryan beat her, about the tiny son she'd lost. She cried, and Matteo took her hand, said nothing, simply stayed beside her like a solid rock in the storm. "You deserve to be loved, Eliza," Matteo said when she finally calmed, his voice low and warm in a way she'd never heard before. "You deserve a family, a home, someone who'll protect you until their last breath." Eliza looked at him, her blue-gray eyes shimmering under the moonlight. She wanted to believe him, but she was afraid. She'd been hurt too many times. She'd trusted Ryan and received fists in return. She'd tried to live well and been met with loss. She didn't know if she still had the courage to open her heart one more time. In the days that followed, Matteo waited patiently. He didn't pressure her, didn't demand anything. He simply stayed by her side and proved through his actions that he'd changed. He gradually withdrew from the violent side of the underworld, handing control over to Uncle Franco, spending more time with his small family. He hired tutors so Eliza could learn what she'd missed as a child. He took her shopping, not for lavish gowns she didn't need, but for books, many books, because he knew she loved reading. He turned the empty room beside hers into a small private library just for her. Eliza felt the sincerity in every smallest act. The wall she'd built around her heart began to crack, one brick falling at a time with every smile he gave her, every gentle look he cast her way when she wasn't watching, every moment he played with Leo and looked up at her as if she were his entire world. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden watching Leo clumsily learn to crawl on a blanket spread across the grass, Eliza instinctively rested her head on Matteo's shoulder. He froze, afraid to move and startle her. Then slowly, he wrapped an arm around her shoulders, drawing her closer. They sat like that in silence, watching Leo laugh out loud, and they both knew something had changed forever. Love didn't arrive like thunder or storms. It came softly, like the morning sun, warm and gentle, slipping into wounds and healing them from the inside. 6 months have passed since that terrifying night, and the Ricci estate is no longer the cold, shadowed place it once was. Baby Leo's laughter now echoes through the hallways. Eliza's lullabies drift softly from the nursery, and Matteo's hurried footsteps can be heard each time he returns home from work. Everything has changed, and love is what changed it all. One late autumn afternoon, as the sunset painted the garden in gold, Matteo led Eliza outside, saying he wanted her to see the newly planted rose arbor. Eliza carried baby Leo with her, suspecting nothing. But the moment she stepped into the garden, she froze in disbelief. Hundreds of candles lined the pathway, their flames flickering like fallen stars scattered across the earth. Deep red rose petals covered the green lawn, forming the shape of a massive heart. And at the center of that heart, Matteo was kneeling on one knee, holding a red velvet box with a diamond sparkling inside. Eliza, From the moment you stepped into my life, everything changed, Matteo said, his voice trembling with emotion. Something that had never happened to the once ruthless Mafia boss. I lived my entire life in darkness. My hands were stained with blood. My soul was buried in shadows. I wasn't worthy of anyone. But you showed me that even darkness can find its way to the light. You saved my son when I failed as a father. You saved me when I no longer knew how to love. You gave me a reason to live, to change, to become a better man. Tears streamed down Eliza's cheeks as she clutched Leo to her chest, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. She, a woman orphaned as a child, abused by her husband for 3 years, who lost her newborn son, who once scrubbed floors for loose coins, was now being proposed to by the most powerful man in Chicago. I'm not asking you to love me for money or power, Matteo continued, his gray eyes fixed on her with profound devotion. I'm asking you to give me the chance to love you every day, to protect you until my final breath, to be Leo's father and the father of any children you want to have. Eliza Monroe, will you become my wife, the mother of my son, and the light of my life? Eliza broke down in sobs, not from sorrow like so many times before, but from overwhelming happiness. She nodded, her voice choking as she spoke the 2 simplest and most sacred words. I will. Matteo stood, slid the diamond ring onto her trembling finger, and pulled both mother and child into his arms. Baby Leo laughed out loud, his tiny hands patting his father's cheek as if offering congratulations. The wedding took place 1 month later, not a lavish ceremony with thousands of guests as people might expect from a Mafia boss, but an intimate celebration in the garden with only their closest loved ones present. Eliza wore a pure white dress, her dark brown hair swept up, a bouquet of deep red roses in her hands. She looked like an angel, and Matteo couldn't take his eyes off her for a single second. When he kissed his bride before everyone, baby Leo clapped and laughed in Martha's arms, as if he understood that he finally had a real family. 1 year after the wedding, the Ricci estate welcomed a new member. Eliza gave birth to a beautiful baby girl and named her Isabella, after Matteo's late wife, as an act of remembrance and gratitude. Matteo held his newborn daughter, looked at his wife lying in the hospital bed with a tired yet radiant smile, then looked at Leo curiously, watching his new baby sister, and he knew his life was finally complete. The estate that was once cold now overflowed with children's laughter. The man who once killed without blinking now spent hours reading fairy tales to his children. The woman who once scrubbed floors in humiliation was now the respected mistress of the family. They found each other in the darkness and walked into the light together.